My name's Hannah Cole. I turned 30 last Saturday, and when I walked into the private room at the Briarstone Hotel in Providence, I realized my birthday wasn't a party. It was a verdict waiting to be read. The chandeliers were lit, but nobody clapped, and my heels sounded like a confession. And the banner on the wall said, Happy 30, but the letters were crooked like someone put them up out of obligation, and the air smelled of steak and old resentment, making my stomach warn me to run right then. 73 relatives sat in straight-back chairs facing a single table with a red folder centered on it, and every face I'd ever chased for approval looked at me like I'd tracked mud across their clean carpet. Some of them held glasses they hadn't touched, and some held their phones at chest level, ready to record as if embarrassment was an heirloom they planned to pass around. My adoptive father, Richard Cole, held a microphone with the same hand he used to pat my shoulder and say, "You're the reliable one." And his voice came out smooth as polished stone when he said, "Hannah, sit down. You owe this family the truth." And I remembered how he skipped my nursing graduation because Maddie had a brand brunch that day. So hearing him call me daughter into that microphone felt like hearing a stranger read my chart wrong. My mother, Elaine, didn't hug me. She stepped close enough that I could smell her perfume. Then she yanked my car keys from my palm and lifted them up for the room to see, as if my own Honda was evidence she could seize, and the metal ring clinked against her bracelet. The same bracelet she bought after telling me money was tight, and when she closed her fist, I saw her knuckles whiten, not from fear, from satisfaction. Right beside her, my sister Maddie grinned into her phone camera, the red live icon shining on her screen, and she whispered loud enough for me to hear, "Don't cry." Hannah crying makes the clip go viral. She promised me it was a party, and now she narrated my face like a product review, tilting her head, waiting for tears to sell. Richard opened the folder, pulled out glossy pages, and held them high like scripture. Then he said, "We tested your DNA. The lab confirmed you're not ours. And since you've been living off what we gave you, you will repay every cent we spent raising you." And I could hear my own heartbeat under the room's silence because I knew DNA tests don't appear out of thin air, and I knew he'd planned this the way he planned church fundraisers with scripts, with props, with people trained to clap on cue. A spreadsheet followed dates and totals in neat columns, and when he announced the number $500,000, the room reacted like the price tag was proof that love had always been a bill. I failed to pay. I did the math without thinking because numbers are safer than feelings, and I felt my cheeks burn when my aunt whispered, "Well, that explains why she never fit in." I scanned the crowd for one kind face for Aunt Janice, who used to slip me extra pie for Cousin Trey, who once told me I was the smart one, but eyes dropped fast and a few people even nodded as if Richard had finally said what they'd been waiting to hear. And in that quiet, I heard the story they'd fed me, that I should be grateful for scraps, that my job only existed because Richard knew someone, and that any love I received was conditional. Elaine leaned in, her smile thin, and she said, "You've always complained, you've always acted like we didn't do enough. So tonight you sign this note in front of witnesses, and tomorrow you start paying us back because you don't get to keep the life we handed you." And she tapped the paper with one manicured nail as if she was stamping my forehead, and I realized they'd invited everyone not to celebrate me, but to make my shame permanent for the record. My throat closed, but my ICU brain stayed awake, and I noticed details that didn't belong a professional video camera on a tripod by the exit. A stranger in a charcoal suit standing alone, and a young woman with a legal folder whispering to him like they were waiting for a cue. His shoes were clean for a buffet, and when his eyes met mine, I felt recognition flicker like looking into a mirror I didn't expect. Richard saw me looking, his jaw tightened, and he barked, "Don't get distracted." Then he shoved the paper toward me and said, "Sign now, apologize now, or I call the hospital board on Monday and I make sure everyone knows the charge nurse candidate is a liar." And the stranger in charcoal took a step forward, then stopped like he was giving me a chance to speak before he spoke for me. "Before I tell you what I did next, like and subscribe if you want the full truth, because what happened in that room changed every name I thought I belonged to." Have you ever been judged before anyone knew your story? For most of my life, I wasn't the daughter they celebrated. I was the daughter they scheduled around quietly. Always. Richard liked saying I was dependable, and Elaine liked saying I was easy, as if love was a convenience too. Maddie was their bright star, and I was the porch light, useful, plain left on for safety only at night. When I was 8, Elaine hosted Maddie's dance recital brunch, and she forgot I'd won a spelling bee too then. I brought home the ribbon, and Richard nodded once, then asked if I could watch Maddie during rehearsal again later. I learned early that applause wasn't for effort. It was for whoever made them look generous in public that day. At 10, I painted Elaine a garden scene, and she slid it into a drawer without reading my note first. Maddie handed her a crooked stick figure, and Elaine squealed, calling her an artist right in front of me, smiling. I remember the refrigerator covered with Maddie's paper crowns while my painting curled in darkness unheard and unseen for years. From then on, I chased approval like oxygen, studying late, volunteering often, and saying yes before thinking each single time. When Richard wanted help, he called my name, and when Maddie wanted attention, he used the word princess for her. Elaine told relatives I was mature, and they praised her parenting while I washed dishes beside their laughter every holiday. By 16, I stopped asking for parties, and I started asking for extra shifts because work felt safer to me. Maddie's 18th had balloon speeches and a rented ballroom, and my 18th got a meatloaf dinner at home only quietly. Elaine patted my shoulder and said money was tight. Then she booked Maddie's beach weekend the next month anyway, too. I didn't argue because arguing made me ungrateful, and ungrateful girls didn't get invited back to the table ever again. When nursing school came, I paid my own tuition, and I took loans because Richard said education builds character alone. Maddie tried one semester, and Elaine called it burnout. Then they covered her rent and posted proud photos online daily. After graduation, I landed an ICU job, and I loved the chaos because alarms don't play favorites with my heart. In that unit, I learned to breathe, count, and move when everyone else froze, and I stayed calm on purpose. Every month, I wired $500 home, and I wrote little notes asking if they needed more this week. 7 years passed, and the total reached $42,000. Yet Elaine still said I never helped enough at all. When my old car died, I asked for a small loan, and Richard stared like I'd asked for mercy once. He said, "You're independent, Hannah. You'll figure it out," and Elaine nodded as if struggle was my brand forever now. 2 weeks later, Maddie asked for $8,000 for content gear, and Richard wrote a check, no questions at all. Elaine said Maddie was finding herself, and she said I didn't need anything because I was capable already so much. Capable became a cage, and I wore it like armor because it kept the peace and paid bills for them. Whenever relatives visited, Elaine bragged about my work ethic, and then she laughed, saying I was intense, sometimes too much. If I didn't smile, they called me cold, and if I smiled, they called me fake, so I stayed neutral. On my 21st birthday, Maddie got a country club dinner, and I got a store cake uncut until morning. Richard raised a toast to his little girl, and everyone cheered while I clapped softly, hiding my sting inside quietly. Later, Elaine told me I understood sacrifice, and she said, Maddie needed sparkle because life's hard for girls like her. I wanted to ask, what about me? But my voice stayed buried like a chart note nobody reads at shift. The truth is, I kept trying because a part of me believed love could be earned with proof each year. I framed every compliment like a medal, and I swallowed every insult like medicine, hoping it would heal me soon. Sometimes Richard would soften and call me sweetheart when he needed something fixed, signed, or covered right away by me. Elaine's favorite phrase was, "Don't embarrass us," and I learned that my feelings were always second to their image today. At family dinners, Maddie joked about my scrubs, and everyone laughed because laughing kept them safe from Elaine's moods too. When I tried to defend myself, Richard frowned and said I was sensitive, and the room turned away from me. So I became the one who apologized first, and I became the one who paid first and waited last, always. I told myself it was normal that families have roles, and mine was support, not spotlight for their storylines. But some nights after a code blues, I'd sit in my car and wonder why I felt orphaned at 30. I'd stare at my hands still smelling like sanitizer, and I'd think they only call when they need something done. That's why the surprise party call hit me hard, because it sounded like change, like maybe I mattered after all. I didn't know that the party was a trap, and that my 30 years of giving made it easier tonight. The week before it, I searched old documents, and I realized I'd never seen my original birth certificate once ever. Elaine said it vanished in a flood, and she said it like a bedtime story, neat, finished, unquestioned for me. Out of curiosity, I checked county records online, and there was no flood that year in our town at all. I told myself I must have missed something because accusing your mother feels like stepping onto thin ice in winter alone. Still, the question stayed like a splinter, and every time Elaine looked away, it dug deeper into my mind quietly. When Richard promised a recommendation letter, he sounded rehearsed, and he insisted on giving it publicly at dinner soon too. He said my girl, and my stomach tightened because he'd never used that phrase for me before, not once ever. I wanted to believe it anyway because hope is stubborn, and because I was tired of being invisible to them. So I bought a navy dress, and I polished my shoes, and I filled a photo album for them carefully. I chose pictures where Richard smiled and where Elaine hugged Maddie and where I stood nearby smiling too for once. I told myself that if they saw the memories, they'd remember I belonged and they'd stop testing me like this. In the ICU, I'm trained to read patterns, and I saw one in my family clear repeating every single year. They praised me in private when nobody could hear, and they diminished me in public when it mattered most, always. They expected me to absorb discomfort, and they expected Maddie to shine because shining made them feel important to others. I carried groceries for Elaine, and I fixed Richard's printer, and I drove Maddie to auditions without complaint each time. When I finally said no, once Elaine cried, and Richard called me selfish, and Maddie laughed right in my face. I swallowed that moment because I didn't want war and because I kept believing peace would be rewarded someday soon. Now, looking back from that red folder, I can see how they trained me to accept less than basic love. They trained me to doubt my instincts and to apologize for needs and to call neglect normal every time too. That's why, at the Briarstone, my legs moved anyway because a part of me still wanted approval from them all. Even with the silence, I searched for a smile and I told myself it was nerves, not cruelty this time. I didn't see that Richard's microphone meant performance, and Elaine's grip meant control, and Maddie meant profit for their brand. All those years, I'd been paying for belonging with money, labor, and silence, and they kept raising prices on me. So when Richard claimed I owed them everything, it landed on a lifetime of conditioning, and it almost worked too. But inside me, a quieter truth was waking, and it whispered. Hannah asked the question they fear right now today. 3 days before the party, my inbox pinged finally again. It was the charge roll, and my name sat shortlisted. I reread the email, then breathed out slow and careful. For 7 years, I'd earned trust one night shift alone. Now the interview waited, and I needed a recommendation letter. My manager leaned close and said, board names still matter. She mentioned Richard, and my stomach tightened, remembering old favors. He'd served on committees, and people still called him generous. I knew word, and it never meant much to me. Still, I called him because my future felt fragile today. Richard answered fast and sounded cheerful, almost rehearsed somehow too. Hannah, he said you're calling about something important right now. I explained the role and asked for a letter privately. He paused, then laughed softly like he'd expected this call. Of course, he replied, I'll write it for you, dear. Relief hit me hard and my eyes stung instantly there. Then he added, I'll present it at your party publicly. I blinked because parties weren't our tradition ever really before. He said it's special and families love milestone speeches anyway. I agreed quickly because questioning him always cost me later. After the call, I stared at my locker, shaking quietly. Hope felt dangerous, yet I let it sit beside me. That night, Maddie texted hearts and demanded I act surprised. She wrote, don't ruin this, it's content for me too. I told myself she was joking because she always joked. Still, her message left a chill under my ribs again. I opened my budget app and checked savings twice carefully. 3 more months, I thought, and I could move out. Moving meant freedom, and freedom meant fewer family emergencies calls. Elaine called next and asked what dress I'd wear there. Her tone was sweet, but it felt sharp underneath today. She said, Navy works and don't overdress, okay, Hannah, please. I laughed lightly because that's how I kept peace alive. On my break, I searched records about that called flood. No news articles appeared, and no county alerts matched 2005. My pulse climbed, and I closed the browser ashamed again. What kind of daughter doubts her mother over paperwork anyway? Yet the question stayed like lint you can't brush off. 2 nights before, I went shopping after a shift alone. I chose a navy dress because it looked steady there. It wasn't flashy, and it didn't beg for attention either. At checkout, my card trembled, and I felt silly today. I pictured Richard smiling and Elaine hugging me for once. I even bought them a photo album bound and neat. I filled it slowly with pictures where we looked normal. In most photos, Maddie was centered and I stood sideways. I told myself angles lie and love hides in corners. The day before, my phone buzzed nonstop with family texts. Cousins asked about parking and aunts asked about my job. Nobody wrote happy birthday, and that absence felt loud too. Maddie called and said she'd arranged a glam moment outside. She insisted I arrive early and let her film reactions. I said sure because saying no made her nasty fast. Richard texted next and wrote, bring your best smile, kid. Kid felt wrong and it made my shoulders tighten again. That evening, I polished my shoes and practiced surprise lines. I whispered, oh my gosh, you shouldn't have thank you. Each rehearsal tasted fake, yet I wanted their approval badly. At midnight, I checked my door lock twice, oddly anxious. Something was coming and my body sensed it before logic. On party day, I woke early and cleaned my apartment. Cleaning calmed me because order felt like protection today somehow. I steamed the dress and packed flats for later just. Before leaving, I called a coworker and confirmed shift swap. I wanted no interruptions because tonight mattered more than pride. Then Maddie pulled up outside my building engine, idling loudly. She held her phone up and filmed my car, smiling. "Hey, sis," she said, "your Honda looks cute on camera." I asked why, and she shrugged like it was nothing. She said maybe Dad wants a before shot for memories. I nodded because questioning her would start a fight now. Maddie leaned closer and whispered, "Don't look tired, okay, please?" I forced a laugh and told her I felt fine. She asked to borrow my car tomorrow, and I agreed. Agreeing was automatic because I'd practiced surrender for years there. When she drove off, my stomach dipped without explanation again. I checked the glove box and found nothing missing yet. Still, I took photos of my mileage just in case. I hated being suspicious, but survival had taught me that. At 4, I started my makeup and kept it simple. I pinned my hair back because I wanted professional calm. My hands shook and I blamed caffeine, not fear, today. Before leaving, I held the photo album like an offering. I imagined Elaine smiling and saying, "You did good, Hannah." I imagined Richard hugging me and calling me his daughter. Those fantasies hurt, yet they kept my feet moving forward. Traffic crawled downtown and my radio played soft classics tonight. I parked near the hotel and sat breathing before entering. The Briarstone looked elegant and I felt underdressed suddenly there. Inside staff guided me and said, "The Cole event awaits." That word event sounded corporate, not warm like family should. As I walked, my heels clicked and my throat dried. I rehearsed my surprised face and fixed my smile again. A server pointed ahead and said, "Your room is there." The nameplate read Cole Reservation, and my heart thudded once. I heard chatter inside, then it stopped like a switch. My fingers hovered on the handle and sweat formed quickly. I mouthed my practiced line and tried to look grateful. For 1 second, I wished I'd stayed home hiding quietly. My hand rested on the handle and memories surged back. I remembered Richard's smile when donors watched him speak brightly. He loved applause and he loved controlling the room always. He taught Maddie charm and taught me silence instead daily. Standing there now, I wondered who he'd invited exactly inside. Maddie promised decorations, yet she'd shown me only her lens. That lens made everything performance, and I hated being footage. Still, I pictured balloons and heard myself laughing like normal. Normal was a word I chased like a lost badge. My phone buzzed again, and Maddie wrote, "Are you here?" I typed yes and added love you, then deleted it. I sent only yes because affection felt unsafe with her. Elaine had texted too and wrote, "Don't be dramatic tonight. No happy birthday again, just instructions like I was staff." I thought about my patients and how strangers offered words. In the ICU, families cry and nobody films for clout. Maddie filmed everything and called it authenticity with a grin. I wondered if she'd bought a ring light for tonight. I wondered if Richard had written the letter at all. He'd never done favors free, and favors always carried strings. I remembered his tone when he said publicly like gift. Gifts from Richard came with invisible invoices attached always too. My palm left the handle and I checked purse quickly. My wallet was there and my ID and my pay stub. I kept documents now because Elaine hid things from me. She'd once lost my immunization card right before school started. She found it later and blamed me for misplacing it. That pattern repeated small disappearances followed by lectures always afterward. So I guarded my papers like they were oxygen now. I even photographed my file for the Honda last year, because Richard claimed connections and people believed him, not me. A memory flashed of Richard shaking hands in hospital hallways. He'd introduced me once as our girl with a smile. Then he turned away and asked donors about golf instead. Tonight he'd call me daughter, but only for an audience. I swallowed hard and told myself he could be changing. People soften at 30, Elaine had said, like it's magic. Elaine's version of magic usually meant a demand later too. Watch showed 6:40 and I realized I was early. Maddie liked early because she could stage the entrance perfectly. I pictured her counting 3, 2, 1 for my face. My cheeks warmed, imagining thousands watching before I even spoke. I hated that feeling, yet I kept smiling anyway there. At end of the hallway, I heard someone clear throat. Silence followed, and it felt rehearsed like stage work to me. I imagined candles, then imagined a microphone, and shivered slightly. My therapist friend once said, "Dread is data, listen carefully." I hadn't listened for years because Elaine called it disrespect. Now I listened, and my body begged for an exit. But my heart begged too, and it begged for love. That contradiction pulled me like two hands on one arm. I checked my phone and saw no missed calls yet. No one asked where I was, they assumed I'd comply. I remembered childhood dinners where I fetched ice without thanks. I remembered Maddie smirking when I spilled and Elaine scolding. Tonight felt similar, except the stakes felt sharper to me. I tried to picture tomorrow after laughter, hugs after peace. I pictured Richard handing me an envelope with pride finally. I pictured Elaine clapping and calling me strong, not cold. I pictured Maddie putting her phone away for one night. Then reality answered with that earlier silence like a warning. I heard footsteps and someone whispered, "Hannah's here, get ready." My scalp tingled because get ready sounded like a cue. Maddie's laugh floated and it didn't sound happy, just eager. Richard's voice replied, "Keep rolling and don't miss her reaction." My breath caught and the album suddenly felt ridiculous now. I almost turned around, but pride kept my feet planted. In the ICU, I don't run when alarms start screaming, so I wouldn't run here even if family frightened me. I rested my hand on handle again and counted breaths. One breath in, one breath out, I steadied my smile. I told myself it's a party, it's safe, it's love. Even as I said it, my stomach insisted it's lie. I heard a chair scrape and a camera lens adjust. Someone cleared throat again and the room held its breath. My fingers tightened and the handle felt cold like steel. I whispered, "Okay, Hannah, you can do hard things too." I straightened my shoulders and lifted my chin slowly now. Whatever waited inside, I would face it eyes open tonight. I felt the second stretch and my heart hammered loud. Then I inhaled and pushed the door open softly anyway. The door swung open and 73 heads turned toward me, their faces blank like a jury awaiting testimony tonight. No balloons floated, no music played, and the banner hung crookedly as if celebration had been rushed for show only. A long table faced my chair and a red folder sat centered bright as a warning under chandelier light alone. Richard stood behind it with a microphone Elaine beside him and Maddie already streaming her smile sharp today for everyone. I stepped forward slowly clutching the photo album and I realized nobody had left space for me anywhere here either. The chair at the end was turned toward them and I sat because 73 eyes demanded obedience from me. My pulse thudded in my ears, but my face stayed steady the way it must in intensive care, always first. Richard lifted the folder, and his voice carried across the room, formal and cold like court proceedings starting right now. "Hannah Cole," he said, "tonight you'll hear facts, and this family will witness your response in full without excuses allowed." He held up glossy lab pages, and the word DNA seemed to glow as whispers rippled through relatives behind me. Elaine's hand squeezed my shoulder briefly, not comfort but control, before she stepped back to speak to the room first. "You aren't ours," she announced, and her mouth twisted like she'd waited years to say it aloud in public too. My knees went loose, yet I gripped the chair arms and I refused to let my breath break for them. Richard slid a spreadsheet forward, columns of dates and costs, and he announced a total of $500,000. Food, clothing, schooling, housing he listed, and each word sounded less like care, more like charges against me tonight alone. A cousin near the back murmured, "I always knew she was different, and nobody corrected her cruelty at all ever." Maddie tilted her phone closer, and the live chat reflected in her eyes, hungry for my collapse right on cue. "Say something," she whispered. They loved tears, and my stomach turned at how practiced she sounded for strangers online now. Elaine stepped in fast, snatched my car keys from my palm, and raised them like a trophy for witnesses here. "Technically, this car belongs to us," she said, "because your job exists due to Richard's connections and our sacrifice too." I tried to answer, but Richard cut me off and he pointed to the crowd, calling them witnesses for everything. He pushed a contract toward me and I saw a promissory note at the top, thick letters like chains around my... "Sign now," he ordered, "and you'll repay us monthly or we'll sue and you'll lose everything you built alone yourself." His smile looked gentle, but his eyes kept darting toward the exit like he feared someone arriving any minute soon. An uncle clapped once uncertain, and then two others joined because obedience spreads faster than courage in families like mine. Richard raised the microphone again and he recited a speech about taking in a child no one wanted 30 years. My cheeks burned and I wanted to scream, but the room's silence pressed down heavy and trained to crush me. I looked at faces I'd hugged at holidays, and they stared back, choosing comfort over truth every single time again. Maddie narrated into her phone, calling it insane content, while comments flew, arguing fake or real about my life tonight. I caught my reflection in a serving mirror and I looked polished like someone else being punished for their sins. Aunt Janice shifted in her chair and her lips trembled, but she stayed quiet when Elaine glared straight at her. Richard leaned forward, voice low, and said he'd call my hospital because reputations can be ruined with one message sent. I imagined the ICU doors closing on me and panic rose, but I forced my hands to unclench slowly again. Elaine tapped the signature line, and she said, We'll keep this private if you cooperate tonight in front of everyone. That contradiction hit me, and my mind grabbed it the way I grab abnormal vitals at work during chaos nights. I stared at the contract, then at Richard, and I asked quietly, "Whose DNA did you compare mine to exactly?" The room paused, and even Maddie's phone dipped because logic isn't as easy to mock when it lands cleanly here. Richard's throat worked, and he muttered dead samples, and Elaine jumped in saying, "My parents died long ago in accidents." I kept my voice calm, and I said, "DNA needs comparison, so how did you get it then and there?" A chair scraped, and someone whispered, "She's right," while Richard's fingers tightened on the microphone shaft hard enough to whiten. Elaine's eyes flicked to the exit, and I followed her glance, noticing the charcoal-suited stranger watching me without blinking. He didn't look amused. He looked wounded, and the young woman beside him held a folder like it mattered deeply. Richard snapped "Ignore him," and he shoved the pen toward me again, insisting this was family business only between us. My lungs felt tight, but I didn't pick up the pen, and I said, "I needed time to read first." Maddie hissed, "Don't stall," and she angled the camera at my hands, hoping shame would make me sign fast tonight. Elaine leaned close, and she whispered that she could ruin me socially because she knew everyone worth knowing in town. Richard's voice rose, and he demanded I apologize, and he promised forgiveness if I admitted my ingratitude on camera now. The word forgiveness tasted rotten, and I realized they wanted control, not closure, and they'd chosen my birthday for leverage. I lowered the album onto my lap, and I saw my own smiling photos, then I closed it gently again. My voice came out steady, and I said, "I won't sign anything until you answer who contacted you recently." A ripple ran through the relatives because that question pointed past me towards something Richard wanted hidden from them all. Richard froze, and Elaine's lips thinned, and Maddie's grin faltered as if she'd lost the script she loved so much. From the corner, the stranger took one measured step, and Richard's face drained while nobody moved to stop him yet. He didn't speak, but his presence changed the room, and my parents' confidence began to crack in front of all. I felt my fear shift into focus, and I knew this wasn't about debt, it was about disclosure tonight alone. Richard gripped the microphone, and he tried to restart the performance, but the crowd now watched him instead of me. Elaine's hand shook around my keys, and she held them tighter as if metal could keep truth out forevermore. Maddie whispered, "This is getting better," and I looked at her, finally seeing greed where love should be in sisters. I raised my chin and I said, "You can't destroy me with lies because I'm done being quiet for you." In that moment, the room held its breath again, and the stranger's eyes stayed locked on mine, waiting to speak. I kept the pen on the table, and I looked at Richard. His smile stayed fixed, but his eyes kept sliding away. I said, "DNA tests need comparisons, so whose sample did you use?" A few relatives leaned forward, and the room finally breathed. Elaine snapped, "That isn't your concern, just sign." I nodded once, and I said, "It's exactly my concern because you're asking for my future. If you want witnesses tonight, then let them hear the truth, not a story you rehearsed too." Richard lifted the lab pages again, and he said the lab did it all. I asked, "How did the lab get DNA from people you claim are dead?" He stuttered, and the microphone squealed, then he blamed paperwork. I said, "You can't test my blood alone and declare I'm not yours." Uncle Pete frowned and whispered, "She's right." Maddie laughed and angled her phone closer, waiting for me to break. Comments pinged on her screen, and strangers defended me while my family kept staring quietly. I slid the contract back, and I asked for time to read. Richard said, "No time sign now, or we sue." Elaine nodded and held my keys like ransom. I said, "Before I sign anything, tell me who contacted you 3 months ago." Maddie sucked in a breath, and her live stream caption froze. Richard's face tightened, and he said, "Nobody contacted us. You're making it up. You don't threaten someone's job unless you're scared, and right now you look scared of that man over there." Maddie tried to laugh it off, but her eyes darted to Elaine. I stepped closer to her phone, and I asked, "What did you see on his computer?" Maddie whispered, "I only saw an email from a law office," and Dad slammed the table. Elaine hissed, "Turn it off," but Maddie kept filming because she didn't know how to stop. I asked, "What did the email say exactly?" Her voice shook, and she said, "End of agreement disclosure," and something about payments stopping on birthday. The room changed after Maddie said agreement out loud. Uncle Pete lifted his brows and asked Richard what agreement meant. Richard barked, "Sit down, this isn't for you." Elaine's hand trembled and her smile looked cracked. I said agreements don't end for no reason unless someone enforces them. Richard swallowed, and I watched sweat bead at his hairline. Then I asked, Were you paid to raise me, yes or no? Elaine snapped. We fed you, we clothed you, and you should be grateful, not suspicious. Aunt Denise. Elaine's older sister rose halfway from her chair, then sat again. Her hands shook and she kept clutching her purse like it held something dangerous. I turned toward her and I asked if she knew about payments. Elaine snapped, leave her alone, she's confused. Denise's mouth opened then closed and she looked at Richard like he might punish her. I said, Denise, I'm 30. Please stop protecting them. Protect truth instead. She whispered, I kept receipts because Elaine told me burn them once. Elaine spun toward Denise and her voice snapped like a whip. She said, You promised. You promised. You promised. Denise flinched and she hugged her purse tighter. I asked Denise what kind of receipts and she shook her head ashamed. She said every month Elaine asked me to pick up cash from a wire transfer and she said it was insurance. Denise looked at me and she added, I saw a name once and it wasn't Richard's. The leaned in and Richard's face went gray. Maddie's phone buzzed again and she forgot to mute the sound. I heard the rapid ping and I saw her follower count climbing. She whispered, This is insane. People love betrayal stories. I glared at her and I said, Stop treating my life like content. Maddie rolled her eyes, but her hands shook because Elaine's panic was spilling everywhere. Richard tried to pull the microphone back and he demanded Denise sit down like he could command reality. Denise stayed standing and she said, No, Richard. Denise looked smaller than I'd ever seen her, yet her voice finally held. She said, I kept quiet because Elaine threatened me with my own mistakes. The relatives murmured and a few looked at Elaine with disgust. Elaine shouted, She's lying. She's jealous. She always wanted my life. Denise shook her head and she said, I believed the insurance story until I saw Marcus Whitfield on one slip. The name hit the room and the stranger at the exit lifted chin as if he'd been summoned. Richard's face drained and he tried to laugh, but nothing came. Elaine screamed, That name is fake. He's dead. He's dead. I stared at her and I said, You told me my biological parents died. Denise whispered, That's what she told all of us for years. My stomach dropped because the stranger's eyes looked familiar. I saw my own eyes in his face and my breath caught. I turned back to Richard and I asked, How can a dead man send wires month after month? Richard slammed the microphone down and his calm mask finally split. He said, You want details, you'll get court papers. He pointed at me and he said, You'll sign tonight or I'll call your hospital tomorrow. My throat tightened, but I kept my voice even because panic helps bullies. I said, If you call, I'll tell them you tried to extort me and your message will be recorded. Relatives blinked because they hadn't heard me speak like that. Denise exhaled like she'd been waiting too. Elaine marched toward Denise and she grabbed the purse strap. Denise jerked back and the papers inside crinkled loudly. I stepped between them and I said, Don't touch her. Elaine glared at me and she said, You don't give orders here. I replied, This isn't your courtroom, it's my life. Richard pulled Elaine back and he kept staring at the stranger. Denise whispered, Elaine told me to burn the slips years ago and I couldn't. She looked at me and she said, I'm sorry, Hannah. My hands were cold, but my thoughts stayed sharp like they do at work. I said, Denise, did the money come in cash or straight to Elaine's account? Denise wiped her cheek and she said Elaine made her pick it up. She said there were always instructions, always secrecy, always a warning. Richard tried to speak, but his voice cracked and the microphone picked it up. I looked at the relatives and I said, You came to witness my shame, but you might witness theirs. Richard raised his hand and he ordered everyone to stop talking. He said, Denise is confused and I am twisting memories. I said then, name the law office and tell them to send it again. Elaine's mouth tightened and she stared at Maddie like a warning. Maddie whispered I saw a logo and the words end of agreement. Richard snapped, You don't know anything, and he tried to smile. I said you built this trap, so answer questions before you demand signatures right now, Richard. Silence followed and I felt the room listening for a crack. The stranger took one step forward and the light caught his silver hair. A young woman beside him held a folder and she checked her watch. Richard's eyes locked on the stranger and fear flashed across his face. I pointed toward the corner and I asked, Who is that man? Richard answered too fast. Nobody, focus on your debt. Elaine repeated nobody and her voice sounded brittle. I said, Tell me why you're afraid. Richard shoved the pen toward me again and he said, Sign or we go to court. I said, Court needs facts and facts are arriving. Denise reached into her purse and she pulled out a folded stack of receipts. The paper looked old and Elaine's face went white. Elaine whispered, Give me that right now. Denise shook her head and she said, "You asked me to burn them years ago." She held the receipts up and she said these were wires and Marcus Whitfield paid. Elaine lunged for Denise, but Richard caught her wrist fast. Uncle Pete rose and he demanded to know about the wires. Richard tried to speak, but his voice cracked and he looked smaller. I stared at the stranger and I saw his jaw tremble in silence. The young woman beside him held her folder tight like it mattered. Denise whispered, "The agreement said he had to wait until Hannah turned 30. That sentence hit me like ice because it meant my childhood was negotiated too." I turned back to Richard and I asked if he knew man. Richard's eyes flicked to Elaine, then slid away from me. Elaine whispered, "Don't listen, he's a fraud." Denise said I saw his name on the receipts years ago. The relatives started whispering and a few stepped back from Richard's table. Maddie's phone rolled and her smile disappeared. I pointed at the stranger and I asked Richard, "Did you tell me he was dead because you wanted control?" Richard swallowed and he didn't answer. The stranger stepped forward and the room opened like water. Richard raised the microphone and he shouted for security. Nobody moved and even the staff looked away. Elaine clutched my keys and her bracelet rattled. Denise handed the receipts to Uncle Pete and his hand shook. Maddie whispered, "This is unreal," and her voice sounded smaller. I gripped the chair because my knees went weak. The stranger's eyes stayed on me, and I knew whatever he said next would change everything for me starting tonight. Richard pushed the note closer, and he said, "Sign or we end you." Elaine nodded, but her eyes were panicked now. I didn't touch the paper, and I didn't look away from the stranger. Denise whispered the agreement forced him to wait until I turned 30. I felt my stomach drop because my birthday was never a gift. It was a deadline, and they meant to lock me down before he spoke. The stranger inhaled, then said my name, and the room went silent completely. The stranger stepped forward, and the room seemed to forget how to breathe. His suit looked expensive, yet his eyes looked broken when they met mine. Richard lifted the microphone again, but his voice came out thin and raw. "Security," he snapped, yet nobody moved, and the staff kept their distance quietly. The man stopped beside me, and he held his hands open, palms up. Denise's receipts trembled in Uncle Pete's grip like paper could burn skin today. Elaine whispered, "He's a fraud," but her voice shook and her mascara cracked. Maddie hovered behind her phone, and for once she didn't look triumphant anymore. The stranger's assistant stepped closer, and she offered Richard a card silently there. Richard didn't take it because his eyes were locked on the man's face. Then the stranger spoke my name, and it sounded like prayer, not pressure. "Hannah," he said. "I'm Marcus Whitfield, and I'm your biological father tonight here." A wave of gas rolled across the room and someone dropped a fork. Richard's face went ash gray and the microphone slipped lower in his hand. Elaine clutched my keys and she stared at Marcus like he was fire. I couldn't speak because my throat felt stitched shut by years of lies. Marcus looked at me carefully and his eyes were wet yet steady now. "Is that what they told you?" he asked, "that I was dead always?" I nodded once, and the movement felt small compared to the truth arriving. He turned toward Richard, and his voice stayed calm, but it carried weight. "Would you like to tell her?" Marcus asked, "or should I do it?" Richard's lips moved without sound, and his confidence finally cracked in plain view. Elaine tried to laugh, but it came out, and the room didn't follow. Marcus opened the folder his assistant carried, and he pulled out bank records. He held them high for everyone, and the papers looked old but official. Richard demanded repayment. Marcus said, "Yet you've already been paid in full, sir." Uncle Pete leaned closer, and he asked paid by whom, with what money. Marcus tapped a line on statement, and the number repeated month after month. $1,500. He said wired every month for 28 years straight. I heard Denise exhale, and I realized she'd carried this guilt for decades. Marcus flipped another page, and Linda Elaine's signature appeared, confirming receipt repeatedly there. Elaine shouted, "Those are fake," but her denial sounded thin against the details. Marcus didn't argue loudly. He just slid copies toward the nearest relatives first. They bent over the papers and the room filled with reading, not gossip. Richard tried to reclaim the microphone, but no one looked at him anymore. Maddie's live stream kept running, and her chat shifted from jokes to outrage fast. Marcus lowered his voice, and he told them, "Catherine Hayes was my mother." When he said her name, my chest tightened like I'd been searching unknowingly. Marcus said they loved each other, yet Catherine's family refused the relationship completely. He glanced at Richard and Elaine, and he said they agreed to conditions. Those conditions included money, Marcus added, and distance until my 30th birthday arrived. Elaine screamed that I was unwanted, but Marcus's grief turned that word around. "I begged to keep her," he said. and I tried to raise her myself. Denise covered her mouth and tears ran down as if she'd failed twice. Marcus reached into his jacket and he pulled out a photograph for me. The woman in it smiled and she had my eyes and my chin. My hand shook and the photograph felt heavier than any chart I'd held. Marcus nodded toward it and he said, "This is Catherine, your mom Hannah." Elaine's face twisted because Catherine's smile looked like something she hated still today. Marcus's assistant stepped beside me and she offered a thick envelope carefully now. Marcus took the envelope back first and his voice softened when he explained. "Catherine passed away when you were 5, he said, and she wrote this." The word cancer hung in the air and even Richard looked away briefly. I took the letter with hands and my fingers could barely hold paper. Maddie whispered, "Read it," yet her voice wasn't gleeful, it was nervous now. Richard tried to interrupt, but Marcus lifted a hand and Richard stopped cold. The room went silent again, and I unfolded the letter slowly and carefully. Catherine's handwriting flowed across the page, and it looked strangely familiar to me. "My dearest Hannah," it began, and my vision blurred before the second line. She wrote that I was wanted, and I felt something inside me unclench. She said Marcus was good, and she asked me not to blame him. I pressed the paper to my chest, and my breath broke into sobs. Across the table, Elaine looked cornered, and Richard's shoulders sagged under witnesses too. Uncle Pete spoke up, and he asked Richard why he demanded money paid. Richard mumbled about costs, but Marcus said love isn't a bill ever, sir. Elaine snapped that Marcus was manipulating me, yet her hands wouldn't stop shaking. Marcus said he came with truth and he didn't need revenge or shouting. He asked for space and for me to choose in my own time. That gentleness hit me harder than Elaine's cruelty because it was unfamiliar here. Denise stepped forward and she admitted Elaine made her collect money for years. Elaine tried to shout her down, but relatives held Denise's gaze instead now. Richard whispered to Elaine and she whispered back, and their marriage looked hollow. Marcus looked at me again, and he said he'd waited because Catherine asked. She was scared, he explained, and she feared losing me forever and completely. I stared at the folder and I realized it was never about me. It was about control and keeping Marcus away until I could be trapped. Maddie glanced at her screen and her follower count began dropping like stones. For the first time, her phone felt heavy and she looked of judgment. Marcus asked if I wanted to leave, and my body said yes immediately. I stood slowly and my knees trembled, but I didn't look at Richard. Elaine stepped into my path and she said, "You can't abandon your family. I answered you abandoned me first, and I'm done paying for cruelty today." Richard tried to say he loved me, but his words sounded like negotiations. Marcus didn't touch me. He stayed close like a guardrail, not a cage. Denise whispered, "I'm sorry," and I believed her because her regret looked real. I walked toward the door, and 3 witnesses watched as my life shifted. Behind me, the red folder stayed on the table like a failed weapon. Marcus said softly, "We'll talk later if you want," and I nodded once. Elaine's grip loosened, and my keys fell to the floor with a clink. No one picked them up because the room understood who the thieves were. Richard stared at the statements and his mouth worked like he'd swallowed sand. Maddie ended the live stream at last and her screen went dark like shame. Denise kept standing and she held her purse open as if confessing too. Marcus's assistant gathered the documents and she spoke quietly with professional calm there. Marcus looked back at Richard and he said, "This ends tonight, Gerald, now." Richard flinched at his real name and I realized Richard was a performance. I stepped into the hallway and the hotel air felt cooler, kinder, safer. My hands still shook, but my heart felt lighter because I wasn't alone. Behind us, voices rose again, yet they sounded distant like a storm passing. Marcus walked beside me quietly, and I carried Catherine's letter like a beginning. I stepped into the hallway clutching Catherine's letter, and my lungs remembered how to breathe. Marcus walked beside me steady like he was guarding space instead of claiming it today. Behind the door, voices surged and shattered, and the hotel staff pretended they heard nothing. Elaine called my name once, desperate and sharp, and I kept walking without turning around. My keys were back in my purse, heavy like proof I wasn't trapped anymore tonight. Outside, the Providence air felt clean, and I realized my birthday had given me truth. Marcus offered me his car gently and without insistence, and I said I needed home. We stopped at the curb under the streetlight, and he asked if I felt safe. I said I was okay, but I was shaking, and he noticed anyway right away. He gave me his number on a card and told me there was no rush. When I got upstairs, I locked my door and I sat on the floor alone. I read Catherine's letter again, then again, and the words untied knots I carried inside. My phone buzzed with voicemails, and I let them stack like stones in pockets tonight. Richard called twice then, Elaine called 12 times, and Maddie sent messages with laughing emojis. I didn't answer any of them, because silence was the first boundary I could hold. In the morning, my manager texted me and asked if I could meet the director. My stomach flipped because Richard had threatened my job and I expected the worst news. I arrived early at the hospital wearing my scrubs and carrying calm like a shield. The administrative office smelled like coffee and the quiet felt louder than any alarm today. Dr. Meera Patel sat behind her desk composed and tired with a laptop open there. She said she received an email from Richard and he demanded they end my employment. My hands went numb and I asked if he had sent the party video too. Dr. Patel nodded, then she said she watched it twice and she took notes carefully. She told me my composure impressed her and the board respected restraint under pressure always. I tried to explain the night, but she raised a hand and said she understood. She said Marcus called her office and he asked them not to favor me either. Dr. Patel said Marcus owns hospitals, yet he insisted my success must be my own. Then she smiled softly and she offered me the charge nurse role outright right there. My chest ached with relief, and I thanked her while trying not to cry again. Dr. Patel said Richard's email backfired and the board removed his name from donor honors. When I left that office, my legs felt light and my life felt newly mine. I called Marcus in the stairwell and I told him I got the promotion today. He didn't celebrate loudly. Instead, he said he was proud and he sounded relieved too. That evening, clips from Maddie's live stream flooded the internet, and strangers named my parents cruel. People stitched the video with commentary, and they paused on Elaine grabbing my keys hard. Maddie posted excuses at first, then she deleted them, and her follower count dropped fast. Brands she tagged went silent, and one sponsor comment called her behavior exploitative and shameful. She tried posting tutorials, but every comment mentioned my birthday, and she couldn't moderate them. At midnight, she switched her account private, and she messaged me that I ruined her. I didn't reply because accountability isn't cruelty and I was done babysitting her ego now. Richard tried calling my hospital, but staff routed him away and his influence looked smaller. Elaine left me a voicemail crying and furious, then begging me to come home soon. She said family forgives, yet her voice still sounded like orders, not love at all. Denise texted me privately and she apologized for staying quiet, then asked how I was. I told her I was surviving and that I needed space before any conversation today. 2 days later, Uncle Pete called me and he said the family dinner group exploded. He said relatives fought about money and several demanded Richard explain the transfers publicly now. Richard tried blaming Marcus, but the paperwork carried Elaine's signature and denial collapsed quickly there. Elaine blamed Richard for greed and he blamed Elaine for secrets, and they screamed daylight. Someone posted their argument online and neighbors recognized Elaine's voice, which made her panic harder. A later Denise told me Richard moved into a rental and he talked about divorce. Elaine accused him of hiding assets and he accused her of hoarding money for years. Denise said Richard found secret accounts and a credit card bill that made him shake. I felt no joy hearing that because their collapse couldn't refund my childhood years back. Marcus texted me once a day, briefly and kindly, and he never asked for anything. He wrote lines like, "I'm here and I saved a seat if you want coffee." I didn't answer right away because trust grows slowly and grief sets its own pace. On the third day, I texted back and I asked for coffee in public soon. We met at a small cafe and he brought no gifts, only patience and questions. He asked about my work and he listened when I described night shifts and loss. I told him I wasn't ready for titles and he said he didn't need them. At home, Maddie posted a tearful apology video and the comments called it performance again. She tried switching to wellness content, but viewers kept asking if she exploited her sister. Clips showed her laughing, and that moment replayed everywhere, making her look cruel and small. I blocked her number, and I blocked Elaine's too, because healing needs quiet for once. At work, colleagues asked if I was okay, and I said I was focusing forward. A friend hugged me in the supply room, and she said families can be toxic. I kept showing up for patients because their crises were honest and mine had clarity. Richard's friends started distancing themselves, and he lost invitations that once made him feel important. Someone removed his photo from a charity page, and he learned reputation isn't owned forever. Elaine tried attending church again, but people stared, and she left before the final song. Denise told me Elaine blamed me for everything, and she still called herself the victim. I told Denise I wouldn't argue with that because I wasn't responsible for her story. The hospital posted my promotion internally, and my name appeared beside the role with pride. I celebrated quietly with takeout and I toasted Catherine's photo, promising I would keep going. That weekend, Marcus mailed me records and he said I could read them later alone. He included a note and it said, "I'm sorry and I'll wait as long needed." I put packet in a drawer and I decided my healing didn't need an audience. The next Monday, Maddie tried returning to work gig platforms and people recognized her instantly. A woman recorded her in line and Maddie burst into tears, then ran outside fast. She messaged me that night and she said I should call off the internet hate. I didn't answer because I can't control consequences and she had chosen her role freely. Denise invited me to lunch and she promised she wouldn't push me toward forgiveness yet. Over soup, she confessed Elaine blackmailed her for years and she hated herself for it. I told her guilt can change into repair and the first repair is telling truth. She nodded and she said she would testify if anyone tried hurting my career again. A month later, I signed a lease and I moved into a small apartment downtown. I carried boxes up 3 flights and I felt strong because every step was mine. Marcus showed up with tools and he asked permission before touching anything I owned there. We built a bookshelf that leaned and we laughed quietly because imperfect felt honest together. When I hung Catherine's photo, I whispered hello and I promised I wouldn't disappear again. Richard sent one long email apologizing and blaming pressure, and I deleted it without reading. Elaine mailed a birthday card late, and it said she missed me with no accountability. I put it in the trash because love without honesty isn't love, it's bargaining again. At the hospital, I trained new nurses, and I taught them to speak up early. I realized my story had changed me, and I could protect others from quiet coercion. Some nights I still shook remembering the red folder, yet I slept easier than before. I wasn't free because they suffered, I was free because I finally chose myself first. When people asked if I would forgive, I said I might, but only with change. On my 30th birthday week, I lost a family and I gained the truth instead. A month passed and I still woke up shaking nightly. Catherine's letter stayed folded and I carried it everywhere quietly. Marcus never pushed, and that gentleness felt strangely new today. Every Sunday he texted asking if coffee felt manageable yet. I answered slowly because trust doesn't sprint after betrayal ever. We met at Harbor Cup, a tiny shop near campus. The barista smiled and pretended our story was ordinary there. Marcus arrived early and chose a corner with lights soft. He stood when I entered and he didn't reach out. He just said, "Hi," and his voice sounded careful too. I sat across from him and held my cup tight. For a minute we stared and the silence stayed kind. I told him my rules and he nodded without offense. I said titles scare me and he said that's okay. He asked about my work and listened like it mattered. I described night shifts and he didn't romanticize the pain. He asked about my favorite patient moment, not my trauma. That question softened me and I answered with a smile. He shared one regret and his eyes watered briefly then. He said he waited because Catherine begged him to wait. He said he paid quietly and hoped love would grow. I swallowed hard and admitted I blamed him sometimes too. Marcus didn't defend himself, and that honesty steadied me more. He asked what I needed, and I said time mostly. We talked 2 hours, and nobody demanded forgiveness from me. When I left, Marcus paid quietly, and I didn't argue. Outside the cafe, he waved and let me walk alone. That night, I slept deeper, and the red folder faded. Still, Elaine's voicemails arrived, and I deleted them daily fast. Richard emailed apologies, and each line blamed pressure again too. Maddie tried new accounts, and strangers kept tagging my clip. I didn't gloat at that because humiliation isn't healing either. I focused on work and trained for my new role. The charge office felt intimidating, but my skills were ready. Dr. Patel checked in often, and she praised my calm. She said leadership shows when pressure tries to bend you. I thought of Richard's threats, and I didn't flinch anymore. My savings grew quietly, and I started touring apartments again. I wanted a place where nobody could take my keys. I toured a floor unit and it smelled like paint. The landlord spoke gently and didn't ask about my family. The kitchen was tiny, yet sunlight filled the window well. I signed the lease and my hands shook with joy. I carried boxes alone and every step felt earned today. Marcus offered movers and I said, "No, thank you, sir." He smiled at that and said, "You're strong already, Hannah." On moving day, Marcus arrived anyway, holding a toolbox quietly. He asked permission first, and that question made me breathe. We built shelves slowly, and we laughed at crooked screws. The bookshelf leaned, but it felt honest and ours now. I framed Catherine's photo and set it near my desk. Each morning, I looked at her and whispered, "I'm here." I didn't feel abandoned anymore. I felt complicated and alive. Marcus and I kept Sundays, and we chose Harbor Cup. Sometimes we talked, and sometimes we just sat quietly there. He told me stories about Catherine laughing at bad jokes. I asked how she sounded, and he described her kindness. He never painted her perfect, and that made her real. I told him about childhood, and he listened without interrupting. Some memories made me laugh, and others made me furious. Marcus didn't rush my anger, and that helped me heal. I started therapy again, and I learned new language too. My therapist said boundaries matter and I practiced saying no. Saying no felt rude, yet it saved my peace daily. Elaine left letters and I returned them unopened to sender. Richard tried gifts and I donated them without reading cards. Maddie posted apologies and I kept her blocked always still. Denise called twice and I answered once with caution today. She cried quietly and said she feared Elaine for years. I believed her pain, yet I didn't offer quick forgiveness. I said, tell truth always and protect yourself first too. Denise promised she would and she sounded relieved afterward now. A week later, Dorothy found my number through Denise again. Dorothy spoke softly and asked if she could apologize today. I paused before answering because her silence hurt deeply too. Dorothy admitted fear and said Elaine controlled every room always. She said she stayed quiet because Richard supported her son. I understood that, yet I told her silence has costs. Dorothy offered recipes and asked about my promotion at work. I thanked her and said contact must stay limited now. Dorothy agreed quietly, and that respect surprised me slightly today. My new apartment felt peaceful, and nights got easier slowly. Still, certain sounds triggered me like microphones and clapping sometimes. I learned grounding tricks, and I used them at home. One night, Marcus asked if he could share more records. I said yes cautiously, and he slid a folder across. Inside were notes and a signed agreement with dates too. It stated he must wait until my 30th birthday passed. My stomach tightened reading that because childhood felt like business. Marcus said he hated it, and he signed for hope. He said Catherine begged him because she feared her parents. I pictured Catherine alone and my anger shifted into grief. Marcus reached for my hand and I let him briefly. He didn't squeeze hard, and that restraint mattered a lot. I asked about her last days and he spoke gently. He said she loved me and worried about my heart. That night I cried and the tears felt clean again. I wasn't mourning only loss, I was mourning stolen truth. The next week Denise texted that Richard filed for divorce. I felt numb hearing it because consequences weren't my goal. Denise said Richard found secret accounts and Elaine blamed everyone. I pictured their shouting and I refused to imagine satisfaction. Healing isn't revenge, it's choosing peace over old chaos today. At work, I trained new nurses and I taught boundaries. I said document everything and never sign under pressure ever. They nodded seriously and I felt purpose replace pain slowly. One afternoon, Maddie emailed from a new address begging again. She wrote she was sorry and asked me to fix. I deleted it because fixing her isn't my job anymore. Later, a coworker asked why I seemed calmer lately too. I told her truth and she said you deserve better. Those words landed softly and I let myself believe them. I started cooking again and my apartment smelled like home. Dorothy mailed a recipe card and I pinned it up. I didn't forgive her fully, but I accepted small effort. Marcus asked if I wanted to visit Catherine's grave someday. I said not yet, and he said, whenever you're ready. That patience felt like love, without terms or pressure today. On another Sunday, Marcus brought a small notebook for me. He said Catherine wrote poems and this held copies too. I opened it slowly, and I felt her presence nearby. The poems were simple, yet they carried fierce devotion inside. I read one line aloud, and my voice trembled softly. Marcus watched quietly, and he let me grieve in peace. Afterward, we walked outside, and I told him thank you. I began to see patterns, and I stopped blaming myself. People-pleasing kept me safe, but it also erased me. I practiced speaking up in small moments at work, too. When someone interrupted me, I said, please let me finish. Each time I did that, my shoulders relaxed more afterward. I stopped sending money home, and my budget finally breathed. I bought a second-hand couch and it felt luxurious. I hosted a coworker dinner and nobody judged my past. They laughed at my stories and they toasted my promotion. I realized chosen family exists and it can be steady. One night, I wrote Richard and Elaine a final message. I said, don't contact me unless you accept responsibility fully. Then I blocked their numbers and my hands didn't shake. I slept through the night and the silence felt earned. Marcus didn't ask me confront them and I appreciated it. He said, healing is yours and I won't steal it. Those words built trust brick by brick inside me slowly. In late autumn, Marcus invited me to a charity dinner. I said a crowd scare me, and he offered quiet exit. We arrived briefly, and he introduced me without bragging once. He called me Hannah, and he let others ask politely. Nobody mentioned money, and I realized dignity can be simple. I spoke with a nurse educator, and she offered mentorship. Marcus watched from afar, and he looked proud, not possessive. On the drive home, I told him thank you again. He said you earned those connections and I just attended. I laughed softly and I realized he meant it fully. That night, I placed Catherine's letter back in its drawer. I didn't hide it. I stored it like a treasure. Next morning, sunlight hit my desk and I felt steady. I started journaling daily and my thoughts grew clearer too. I wrote about the party and I named the abuse. Naming it helped because confusion used to protect them always. I wrote about Denise and I left space for her. I wrote about Maddie and I stopped calling her harmless. I wrote about Richard and I saw his fear clearly. Fear doesn't excuse harm, and I promise myself that now. In therapy, I practiced saying I deserved love without earning. That sentence felt strange, yet it warmed my chest quietly. Marcus asked if I'd like to meet his sister someday. I said maybe later, and he smiled with respect again. He never treated me like a project, and that mattered. I began calling him Marcus, and the word felt softer. One Sunday, I almost said Dad, and I stopped myself. Marcus noticed, and he didn't react or push at all. He said titles can wait and relationships grow with time. I nodded and I felt safe enough to try more. In December, I hosted a small birthday redo dinner home. Co-workers brought cupcakes and they sang without cameras near me. I laughed until tears came and nobody used them online. Marcus came briefly and he stayed in the background quietly. He hugged me lightly and he asked if it's okay. I said yes, and I meant it without doubt today. Later, Denise dropped off soup and she didn't enter inside. She wrote a note and she apologized without excuses again. I texted thank you and I said I needed distance. Denise replied, I understand, and that reply felt different now. I started to trust her, but slowly and carefully still. Richard never apologized properly and I stopped waiting for it. Elaine sent one last voicemail blaming me for everything still. I deleted it instantly and I felt my spine strengthen. Some nights I rewatched the clip only to remind myself. I wasn't crazy and I wasn't imagining their cruelty either. Reality is grounding when gaslighting tries to rewrite you daily. That lesson stayed, and I carried it into leadership work. I told new nurses, your voice matters even when shaky. I told them, ask questions when paperwork feels rushed ever. I told them, choose dignity over approval that hurts you. Marcus called one evening and asked if I wanted dinner. I said yes, and we tried a simple diner downtown. He ordered pancakes and he laughed at my coffee habit. I realized laughter returned when safety returned first, too. After dinner, he asked if I wanted to visit Catherine. I paused and I said, maybe next month, not tonight. He said okay, and he didn't look disappointed at all. That respect felt like love, and I let it in. On my desk, I kept a note from Dr. Patel. It said you earned this, and don't let them define. I read it often when doubt tried returning late nights. I also reread Catherine when grief felt heavy again inside. Slowly, I accepted both truths: love existed and harm existed. I didn't need to pick, I needed to move forward. If you're watching and you've been judged unfairly too before, I want you to know your worth isn't negotiable ever. Love that demands silence isn't love, it's control always. Boundaries aren't revenge, they're self-respect and they save lives. Sometimes family is chosen, and sometimes family must be left. I'm not bitter now, I'm clearer and I'm free today. If you were me, would you forgive? Richard and Elaine comment A for yes and tell me why you would. Comment B for no and tell me what line crossed. Comment C depends and share what change you'd require first. If this story hit you, subscribe and stay for more. Wherever you're watching from, I hope you choose yourself today. And if nobody claps, remember, quiet courage still counts always.